Hi everyone. So chapter 3 talks about two important institutions of American government, federalism and the separation of powers. What I'm going to talk about in this lecture is federalism, so what it means and how it has evolved over time. So federalism divides power into two levels. We have our national government and state governments, and this helps limit overall power of government because it is broken into two parts, and the state and the national or the federal level kind of compete against each other. There are 4 stages of federalism that your textbook talks about, and you can see the outline here. We'll go through each of them in a little bit more detail. The first stage of federalism was dual federalism. So under this arrangement, powers were shared between the federal and state governments, and it was carrying out what the framers of the Constitution intended. So the national government was stronger than it had been under the Articles of Confederation, but at the same time, most of the important powers, the things that really influence the day-to-day life of citizens, those were decided on the state level. So this was called dual federalism. One of the cases that exemplifies this period was Gibbons v. Ogden. We will talk about that in more detail in a minute. Starting in the 1930s is when you see a shift towards what is called cooperative federalism. So the 1930s is when the country was trying to emerge from the Great Depression. President Roosevelt was trying to enact a whole bunch of new policies that would really expand the national government's role in the economy. So things like the TVA, things like Social Security, all of these policies were new, and it was a larger role for the national government. The Supreme Court at first looked at this and said, no way, none of this is constitutional. President Roosevelt's response to that was, okay, I hear you. I am going to appoint a whole bunch of new Supreme Court justices, and then we'll see. And the Supreme Court backed down. They said on further reflection, okay, this is constitutional. So there's no telling whether Congress would have allowed Roosevelt to actually pack the courts, but during this standoff, this was what led to this change. And the case that is the real turning point is NLRB versus Jones and Laughlin Steel Company. Again, we'll talk about that in a bit. So we've entered this period called cooperative federalism. So it's kind of more of a partnership between the national government and state governments. And so basically what was happening in this period is that the national government didn't really have the authority to tell states to do certain things, but what they could say is, we would like you to do this when it comes to education policy, or we would like you to do this when it comes to transportation or housing or whatever. And if you do it, we'll give you some money to pay for it. This is this grants in aid that money was handed over to states, but it wasn't just handed over, do what you want. There were strings attached. They said, you know, we would like you to enact this specific policy. If you do it, we will give you money. So this was starting to kind of blend the functions of the national government and state governments. By the 1960s, we were heading towards a period that was starting to be described as regulated federalism. So as these grants in aid were expanding, getting larger and larger, they were taking up a larger share of state budgets. One of the big programs that expanded was Medicaid. So this is a health insurance program which is administered by the states but is largely funded by the national government. So it is this big transfer of funding from national to the state level. And as state and local budgets became more and more dependent on federal funding, it gave the federal government a lot of leverage to dictate national standards, because now they could simply threaten to withhold funding. So, for example, in the 1970s, the national government instituted a nationwide speed limit of 55 miles per hour. And some states didn't like this idea, but they said, well, if you don't enact a 55 mile per hour speed limit, we will withdraw federal highway funding. And so states really had very little choice. A similar move is how the drinking age was raised to 21 across the whole nation. In 1990, Congress passed the Americans with Disabilities Act. So this required all government buildings, including schools, any state buildings, anything run by the government, to have access for handicapped people. And the problem was that the federal government provided no funding to make this happen. So nobody opposes the idea that, someone in a wheelchair should be able to gain access to school or should be able to gain access to a post office. But the problem from the state perspective is they were asked to be making all of these changes and not given any funding to help with that. And so this is an example of an unfunded mandate. So this was what was happening in the period from the 60s through the 90s, that more and more decisions were being made by the national government, and states were strongly coerced into going along with them. By the 1990s, there was a move in the other direction, kind of a sense that we had gone too far in the level of national government being able to impose uniformity on the states. So this is the period described as New Federalism. You see an attempt from Congress to make national policies that give the states more discretion to enact the policies that they like. The Unfunded Mandates Reform Act was passed. This act does not prevent Congress from imposing an unfunded mandate, but it makes the whole process more transparent. So the Congressional Budget Office will calculate the cost of any piece of legislation, any mandate imposed on state and local governments. And anything that is above $50 million per year can be stopped on the floor of Congress, and they have to hold a vote. So it is on the record. Congressmen have to say, okay, knowing that this is going to impose this amount of cost on the states, are we going to go forward? So it's something that makes congressmen a little more accountable for passing these laws. So that is one change that has come out of Congress. You also see a change towards using block grants, which have fewer restrictions on how states can use the money. So where the older grants and aid were much more specific about, okay, we are giving you this amount of money and we want you to use it exactly this way to promote education or to promote housing or crime prevention or whatever it is. The block grants are more broader. They are, a chunk of money that a state can use how they see fit. So it gives them a lot more flexibility. And you also see the court interpreting the Interstate Commerce Clause more narrowly. So we will talk about that next. So the Commerce Clause comes from Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, where it lists all of the powers of Congress. And so it says the Congress shall have power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, among the states, and with the Indian tribes. So looking at these different cases through time and highlighting the different ways the Commerce Clause has been interpreted really can illustrate how the definition of federalism and the boundary between national and state has changed over time. So in the era of dual federalism, you have three cases here. So Gibbons v. Ogden was about steamboat navigation between New York and New Jersey. And the rule was, yes, Congress does have power to regulate this. This is navigation between states. This is interstate commerce. The Swift v. U.S. case was about monopolies and said, yes, okay, Congress does have the power to regulate monopolies. However, there are limits, and the 1918 case of Hammer v. Degenhardt really shows this. This ruling said that Congress does not have the power to regulate child labor. So Congress has this broad power for things that are relevant to improving the national economy, but child labor is legitimately a state matter. So whether or not you are allowed to use children in factories, that should be decided on a state-by-state basis. So this was the kind of thinking of the courts during dual federalism. So in 1937 is when we see the turning point towards cooperative federalism. And this was the case of the National Labor Relations Board v. Jones and Laughlin. And the ruling here was that a company was not allowed to fire workers for trying to organize a union. It was setting this larger precedent that a government agency did actually have the authority to regulate a corporation, particularly if it was a large corporation that had operations in several states. So this is the case that is the big turning point. The next case that I'll talk about gives an example of one of the cases during the period of regulated federalism. So this was even stronger authority for the national government to regulate commerce. And this case was the Heart of Atlanta Motel v. United States. This came about after the Civil Rights Act, where it was now the law of the land that private businesses are not allowed to discriminate in serving customers on the basis of race. And so the Heart of Atlanta Motel filed suit and said, you cannot dictate to us who we serve and who we don't serve. Our own conscience should determine that. And the ruling was like, no, that's not how it works. Congress has the power to do this. So even enforcing civil rights was seen as broadly under the umbrella of the Commerce Clause. And here are some cases that illustrate new federalism, kind of going back the other way. It started to reflect a feeling that the Commerce Clause had been interpreted so broadly that it was starting to cover just about anything to do with manufacturing, the economy, whatever. So all of these cases are listed in your book. I'll just briefly talk about the first one. So U.S. v. Lopez was a case about a federal law that barred handguns near schools. And the argument was that this is within the powers of Congress given to it by the Commerce Clause. And you have to stop and think a little bit. So how does the Commerce Clause tie back to the issue of handguns near schools? And so usually when we discuss this in the classroom, there's a lot of, I don't know, it's a little bit of a stretch. And that is exactly what the Supreme Court said, that, you know, you cannot tie anything that happens anywhere to the Commerce Clause. You know, Congress has powers that have to be limited by the Constitution. So again, this is something that should be a state matter. And it goes through 2006. A lot of the cases are very clearly in the direction of returning more flexibility to states as opposed to Congress making decisions for the whole country. Since that time, they describe it more as a tug of war, that you see some cases leaning towards national power, some cases leaning towards upholding state power. It's not clearly one direction or the other. So here is how the book sums up the 4 stages of federalism. Think about cake. So dual federalism is like a layer cake where the roles of the national and state governments are really distinct from each other. Cooperative federalism is more like a marble cake where it's blended, and you see in some policies both state and national government are involved. Regulated federalism is when the national government is mandating the recipe and states have to figure out how they're going to provide the ingredients. New federalism is giving more flexibility back to the state. So now state governments are the ones providing the recipe and national government is helping provide the ingredients. So there are lots and lots of specific issues that have to do with federalism. Most of the things we fight about can be tied back to federalism. Should we have one consistent national policy on this issue, or should each state be able to make up their own minds? So lots and lots of things. So here is one example. This is very topical. We're hearing a lot about this in 2020. It turns out that elections are administered at the state level. So laws about voter registration and how people vote vary from state to state. So this chart comes from 2018. I won't guarantee that it is still 100% accurate by the time you are watching the video, but the broader message that registration and voting laws vary from state to state is very much still true. If you look at the top left here, it looks at online registration. And so you can conclude many states allow online voter registration. There are some states in red that do not allow it, but most do. When it comes to same-day registration, on the top right, it's a different picture. So relatively few states allow you to register to vote on election day. In most cases, you do have to register in advance of the election. Down on the lower left, you look at laws about early voting, and the majority of states do have some sort of early voting period. Over here on the bottom right is when you get to no excuse absentee voting. And that is what we're talking about a lot today. That is essentially mail-in voting. And so you can see that quite a few states allow this. You don't have to have any reason. You don't necessarily have to be in the military and stationed outside of your state. You don't necessarily have to be attending school in a different state. If for whatever reason you would prefer to vote by mail, you request an absentee ballot. And you can see that extremely Democratic states have this policy, extremely Republican states have this policy. I'll just put it out there that there's not a lot of evidence that this causes fraud. There is not evidence that this benefits one party or the other. This is something that has been done by many states for many years. But again, it brings us back to federalism. A lot of times the things that we argue about, it has some connection between how much flexibility should states have versus how much authority does the national government have to make a consistent policy. So I'll leave that there for now. Also review the material in the chapter about the separation of powers, and we will see you again soon.